Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Felice Snade with the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County. I'm so glad to welcome you to our Federation Live Yom Hashoah program. It is wonderful to see the turnout for today's event. It is a record breaker. We see many familiar faces and many new people joining us today. Our virtual programs are among the many ways our Federation is reaching out to bring our community together as we also work to meet the critical needs for our people. We are and will remain the community funder, planner, and convener. Before we start our program, we want to let everyone know that you are all on mute and that this program is being recorded. It is a privilege and a pleasure to announce that our CEO and President, Matt Levin, is with us today, and we're going to turn it over to him for some comments. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Felice. Thank you to everybody who arranged this call. You're in for a great treat today on the call. Our guest speaker, Ralph Nurnberger, is a friend and colleague of more than 30 years at this point of mine. He has an incredible wealth of experience, as you'll hear from the introduction that Felice is going to give in just a second. But Ralph is truly a treat. Every time he comes back to our community, he knows our community well. And so we look forward to hearing his presentation today, and in front of everybody and 300 people on the call. Also, thank you to Ralph for taking the time to be part of our virtual community now as we all deal with this virus. Let me just take a couple minutes to say thank you. Everybody, all this entire community has come together as we continue to wait out this pandemic and its impact on our community. We're very proud of the way the Jewish community has come together on food distribution, caring for elderly, caring for those who have lost their job. Jewish Family Service today is overwhelmed with phone calls. We have emergency funds available to those seniors who are in trouble. We've been working with our partner agencies, rabbis. It's really an incredible community that we live in, and I hope each and every one of you has had an opportunity to take a step back over this last month, participate in the programming that's on the web, look at the portal, find ways you can help or be helped, and be part of this incredible mosaic of a Jewish community that we have and that we're all so proud of. We know that this thing's not over, and we're going to continue to isolate. We're going to continue to work from home at times until we know more and we know how much more we're going to be a threat to those we love and we care about. And as many organizations and businesses are going to say, we're going to use science to determine when we're going to come back to work and when our Jewish community will be back to being a live, in-person community. But in the meantime, your federation and the agencies continue to do hard work protecting those who need to be helped here, locally, in Israel, and around the globe that have all been affected by this pandemic and the normal course of life that we do as part of the partner agencies. We will continue to do our work. Which leaves me with my last comment. I know this is a tough, difficult time. I know people have watched the economy and watched their savings, but if you're in a position, we still have an annual campaign to run. And the way we rebuild this community and plan not just for today and deal with today's problems, but make sure that we have the available resources for tomorrow when we come out on the other side, as we must continue to go out and ask people to support the annual campaign so that we have the resources to handle this crisis and the next crisis that comes down the road. Our job as planners in this community is exactly that. Plan for good, plan for the worst, take care of rich, take care of poor, take care of young, and take care of old. And it never stops just because we find ourselves in the midst of a crisis. So if you haven't yet been able to support your federation, think about doing that today. Think about going on the web, calling a federation professional. But for overall, thank you for everything that you do and your continued support of our virtual Jewish community and the way in which we've all come together over the last weeks and will continue to in the near future. And with that, Felice, I'm going to turn it back, I think, to turn it over to Rabbi Josh Brody, who's going to open up our program today on Yom Hashoah. Rabbi Josh, thank you.
So much, Matt. Thank you. And if there's ever been a program that's hard to introduce, always going to be a program that's taking place on Yom Hashoah, on Holocaust Memorial Day. You see, when you look out at the hundreds of people that have tuned into this program right now, it's inevitable that there are going to be Holocaust survivors that are watching. I know who you are because I can see some of your faces. you speak about the Holocaust when you're looking directly into the eyes of those who survived this era in our history, which is so terrible. There's nothing to really compare to it. And you know that we live in a community that has to have more Holocaust survivors than almost anywhere else in the world. And we have a community that takes care of those Holocaust survivors, a community that involves all of you. So thank Matt, thank you everyone that helped put this program together, and you're in for a very, very big treat. A very, very great class is about to begin with Dr. Nurnberger. But I want to begin telling you about a reminder that popped up on my computer just a short time ago. You see, calendar, just like many of you have meetings that you put on your calendar, I had a meeting that I was supposed to be at this morning. Unfortunately, the meeting was canceled. I was supposed to be walking out of the gates of Auschwitz and headed to Birkenau. Not by myself, with almost 200 teenagers from our local Jewish community. It would be part of a bigger group of almost 15,000 from dozens of countries around the world. I'm wearing a jacket that I would have worn just this morning at the March of the Living ceremony. And when we think about what we're able to do and not able to do, unfortunately, for that group of teenagers who we had a chance to meet with just last night on a Zoom call similar to this, they're be able to attend this year's March. So you'll say, oh, they'll get a chance next year. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. There are too many students in high schools around the country that you might not believe, but it's just the reality. They don't know what the Holocaust is. Now we have an entire generation of students from around the world. They won't get a first-hand account along with our local Holocaust survivors that travel with us to hear and feel and touch and smell what it's like to walk into a gas chamber or walk on the ancient streets of Poland and Krakow or in Warsaw. Unfortunately, they're not going to get that. But like I had a very different experience on Passover this year, for better or for worse, probably a little bit of both. We got to see something very different. And the teenagers that didn't get a chance to go this year, unfortunately, are not going to be able to hear the message of the former chief rabbi of Israel that used to tell us each year so many powerful and insightful stories, because he's not just former chief rabbi. You're talking about someone that he himself was a survivor of a concentration camp called Buchenwald. And I'll remember the story he told us last year, where he said to the students, and that's what it's all about, because it's those students that need to hear these messages. And if you take a look, unfortunately, you're looking on the screen right now, you don't see too many younger folks, and they're the ones that need to be here. And that's why we're working harder and harder to engage them. But he would say, you know, the rest of the world, different countries said to the people, like you a little bit more would dress like us, be a little bit similar to us. So we did it, and they hated us, and they still wanted to kill us. So we said, okay, maybe they want to be a little bit more different. So we did as well. We dressed differently. We acted differently. They hated us, wanted to kill us. They said, oh, maybe it's because we live amongst them. Maybe it's because we have our aspirations for our own national state that they still hate us, they still wanted to kill us. Maybe it's because we live amongst them. It's not because we have our own place. They still hate us and wanted to kill us. We're going to hear these messages. Where else are these teenagers going to hear these messages? The good news is the day is not over. And there are dozens of programs taking place across the place in our own community. And everyone can hopefully live up to that responsibility to honor the memories of those that we lost. The day is not over. We need to take the message we're going to hear from Dr. Nurnberger, and we need to go and call, contact any of our younger family members, teenagers, college students, grandchildren, children, and say, what are you doing to honor the memory today of those that we lost, those 6 million? We're going to go and we're going to light a candle in just a moment. But I hope that if there's ever a message that I think we can learn right now, this time from this coronavirus, this virus affecting the whole world, I think it's the message that I've always been bothered by. You think about the Holocaust, you look at a country called Germany, and you look at many other countries which had people that were filled with hatred, leadership, sometimes very cultured people, usually very cultured and educated people. that somehow just turned on the Jewish people. And you ask yourself and you say, how could it be that something so big could happen so quickly? It's impossible. And you think back and you look at our own times right now, is it possible that something could happen so quickly, so drastically? And you look back, and I would ask you 3-4 weeks ago, would you ever have they would be sitting right now observing Yom Hashoah, not in our synagogues, not in our communities, not in our homes with our loved ones, but we'd be sitting watching a video? The answer is of course not. And it's not only happening here in South Palm Beach, it's happening in New York and Israel and South Africa and Australia. Everyone is tuning in via some sort of virtual platform. The world changed, and it changed in an instant. And when we honor the memories of those 6 million with the 6 candles to light right now, always remember that things can change very, very quickly. And that's why we're so blessed to have the support of a community that understands this, that gets it, that cares about each and every one of us, because they recognize that things can change and things do change. Let's continue to spread the message, honor their memory as we light 6 candles to represent a number which is unfathomable, 6 million. By saying, remember, there are many more opportunities you can participate in today. Just go to our virtual website platform, virtual.jewishboca.org. Masam Srura, Bitsror Achai, may their souls, may their memories be bound in bonds of life for all eternity. Never forget them and never forget the lessons that they left for us.
Thank you, Rabbi Josh Brode, who is the director of the Deborah and Larry Silver Center for Jewish Engagement. And thank you, Matt. And thank you to our donors on this program, who should be so proud to know that your dollars are making a difference to those who need assistance and are turning to our Federation now. And for anyone who wants more information about our vital work or knows someone in need, please call us at 561-852-3100. And now on to our featured speaker, which is why you're all here, our esteemed Dr. Ralph Nurnberger. Dr. Nurnberger has spoken frequently at various events sponsored by the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County. He is also a frequent guest lecturer at FAU's Lifelong Learning Center. We had originally planned for Ralph to make 5 presentations today as part of our commemoration of Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Obviously, all of these events were canceled, but we are delighted that he is able to join us via Zoom and that all of you are able to join us. So thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nurnberger.
Elise, thank you very much for the introduction. Matt Levin, we've been friends for about 33 years, I think we figured out. So I'm delighted that you're on this call as well. I'd like to thank the entire Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County for arranging today's presentation. This was not easy. It involved a lot of people doing a great deal of technical work. Unfortunately, when it comes to technology, I am still a dinosaur, so I'm not totally sure how all this is working. As Felice correctly said, originally the Federation had planned 5 events to commemorate Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Early on, when the pandemic first hit, the Federation was way ahead of the rest of the country, and Florida in particular, when social distancing was not a term that we used very much. And they had the foresight to combine the 5 events into this one Zoom event. And so now, I guess we're all in the Zoom where it's happening. Again, I have no idea who all the 400 people are who have signed in for this event, but I'm willing to bet that they have the cleanest hands of any audience that have ever come to any talk I have given in the past. Most important, I join with the Federation and everyone else to hope that people stay safe and healthy as we go through this awful event. As Felice mentioned, this day is of particular significance to me. My stepfather was the only member of his immediate family who did not perish in the Holocaust. His parents, mother and father, his brother and sister, who would have been my grandparents, and my uncle and aunt, among other relatives and family friends, all died in a concentration camp called Theresienstadt, also known as Terezin. Terezin, and I had the good fortune of visiting it, or bad fortune, whatever, of visiting it a few years ago, is in the suburbs of Prague. Today's talk deals with children who were rescued from Prague in 1939 from the Nazis. Sadly, most of their parents and relatives also did not survive. It's now time to discuss the remarkable story of the man who saved these children, Nicholas Winton. And we should put up the first, there it is. Nicholas Winton was born in 1909 in Hampstead, London. He passed away in 2015, which means that he ultimately reached an age of 106. That's only a small aspect of his remarkable life. Nicholas and his wife, Greta, had a very close, loving relationship for many decades. They were particularly close to their two surviving children and to their grandchildren. And as they got older, they, like most grandparents, took great pride in their grandchildren's development. After he retired from a career in finance, usually with low-level jobs, he spent his time doing charity work and philanthropic work. In late 1987, his wife began to complain that there were too many books and papers around the house and suggested that they start cleaning up. Nicholas told her that he wasn't interested in cleaning up the papers. She should just throw them away. She was in charge of the cleanup. He would prefer spending his time doing gardening. I'm sure by now many of you are wondering, what does this have to do with Holocaust Remembrance Day? Well, Greta went up into the attic and she was cleaning out the attic and she stumbled across an old leather briefcase which contained a scrapbook from 1939. The scrapbook had documents and pictures of children Greta had never seen before, as well as lists of names and letters going back 50 years. She came down from the attic and asked Nicholas about the scrapbook. Nicholas told her, oh, those are pictures and information about the 669 children I saved from the Nazis in 1939. She had no idea. In their 40 years of marriage, the topic just never came up. Not only did Greta and Winton have no idea what Nicholas Winton had done, no one else did either. In fact, the nearly 700 children whom he saved were completely unaware of who saved their lives or how this was done. Nicholas Winton later said that he did what he could and then moved on with his life. He saw no great need to get credit for doing this. Greta had no idea how to follow up, so she gave the scrapbook to their son, Nick. He in turn provided the scrapbook and all the materials to a Holocaust historian by the name of Elizabeth Maxwell, who then sought to ensure their authenticity. After ascertaining the authenticity, Dr. Maxwell then turned the documents in the scrapbook over to the producers of a BBC television program called That's Life, which was one of the most popular programs on British television. It usually reached an audience of about 18 million per week. The program was hosted by a famed journalist by the name of Dame Esther Ranson. The producers of the program contacted the Wintons, Nicholas and Greta, and told them that there was going to be a mention of his scrapbook on an upcoming program and invited them to come to a live production on February 27, 1988. Nicholas and Greta gave so little thought to what might transpire that Greta, thinking this would be rather dull and shouldn't really feel like going into downtown London, said she decided to stay home and would watch it on TV if she had the time. They had no idea what was in store. Esther Ranson began the program by holding up a copy of the scrapbook and explaining its contents. She told the story about the evacuation of endangered, mainly Jewish children from Czechoslovakia just before the outbreak of World War II. She told her vast audience, again, probably around 18 million people, that nearly all of the families that were left behind were murdered by the Nazis. She explained that none of the rescued children ever knew how they came to be saved. She flicked through the book, pointing out various letters and documents, and finally came to a list of all of the rescued children, their names, their addresses, as well as where they were sent after they left Czechoslovakia. She then said she would pick one name at random and see what she could find out about it. The name she picked was Vera Diamant. She then announced that Vera was in the audience. In fact, she said, "Hello, Vera." She told Vera that she was sitting next to the man who had saved her life. Vera and Nicholas were sitting next to each other. Notice Nicholas does not look very happy at this time. This was the first time that Vera met her savior. She couldn't restrain herself. In front of millions of viewers and the audience, the live audience, she hugged Nicholas Winton and sobbed, thank you," and kissed him. Winton, a normally restrained man, could not hold back his tears. For the producers of the program, they were obviously delighted to have aired such an emotional and intense moment live on TV, but it was almost thwarted before the program began. Just before the program began, Nicholas Winton saw that a friend of his was in the audience, and so he asked Vera to give up her seat so that his friend could sit next to him. Vera knew what was going to happen and had been forbidden by the producers to give up her seat, so she refused. So the first encounter between Nicholas and Vera was not so joyous. Obviously, they got over that very quickly. The hostess, Esther Ransom, later admitted that the moment she introduced him was the only time on television in her long career doing this that she burst into tears and had to stop to recover. She later reflected that, quote, "Nothing I have ever done before or since has had such an effect." The producers then invited the Wintons, Greta and Nicholas, to come back for a follow-up program on March 6, 1988. This time, Greta agreed to accompany her husband to provide him with support for whatever was in store. The Wintons had no idea. They were unaware that the producers of That's Life had found over 80 people living close to London who were saved by Nicholas Winton. Esther Ransom began the program by retelling the story. She then asked if there were any people in the audience who had been rescued by Nicholas Winton and if they would please stand up. The cameras panned the audience. Suddenly, all of the people in the first 6 rows stood up. This was the moment when the rescued children, by then adults in their late 50s and 60s, many of them married, many of them grandparents in their own, met for the first time the man who had saved their lives by organizing their escape from Czechoslovakia, from Prague in 1939. Virtually all of those whom Winton had saved when they were children lost their entire families. After the initial revelation, Winton met frequently with those whom he had saved and their families as well. Those whom he had saved afterwards always referred to themselves as Nicky's children. They had so many questions. They wanted to know how they were selected to be saved. They asked how the rescue missions were organized and funded. They asked what efforts were made to save others. They wondered what more could have been done to save more people. Most of all, they wanted to know more about the man who had saved them. He was not a diplomat. He had no experience with rescue operations. He was not even a Czech. He couldn't even speak the language. They kept asking what a young British businessman was doing in Prague in the first place in 1939. What motivated him to undertake such a task? In an effort to answer these and other questions, it's time for us finally to discuss the life of Nicholas Winton. Winton's grandparents on his father's side, so his paternal grandparents, were named Nicholas and Charlotte Wertheim. They arrived in Britain in the late 1860s as part of a wave of German Jewish immigrants who came to Britain in the 1860s. Nicholas Wertheim was a merchant banker. Nicholas and Charlotte's son, Rudolf Wertheim, ultimately became a successful businessman who spent time in both England and in Germany. Rudolf Wertheim met his wife Barbara in Germany in 1907. Rudolf and Barbara Wertheim ultimately had 3 children. Their middle child was named Nicholas after Rudolf's father. This is the Nicholas of our story. The home life of Rudolf and Barbara Wertheim and their 3 children resembled most middle-class British families at the time, although unlike most British families at the time, they spoke German at home, and it later turned out to be very useful to Nicholas later in his life. It's significant that their German background was more important to the Wertheim family than their Jewish religion. Barbara and Rudolf Wertheim did not attend synagogue, did not practice Jewish rituals at their home. They pragmatically concluded that being Jewish in Britain could be a disadvantage to their children, so they had their children, including Nicholas, baptized. Later on, the family changed their name from Wertheim to Winton. We'll get into that in a little bit. Although Rudolf died at the relatively early age of 56, Nicholas credited his father with having a major influence on his development and his character, in particular developing empathy for other people. Although his parents were Jewish, Winton insisted that that had no connection with his willingness to transport nearly 700 Jewish children from Czechoslovakia to Britain. He said he saw children, not Jewish children, and wanted to save them. On the other hand, because his parents were Jewish, the officials at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, have never recognized Winton as one of the righteous Gentiles. Nicholas was relatively short. He ultimately grew to be only 5'6" as an adult and did not enjoy the rougher team sports that most of his childhood friends did, like rugby and cricket. He became, however, extremely proficient in individual sports like ice skating and fencing. In fact, he became such a competitive fencer that he ultimately made the British national team, which would have participated in the 1940 Olympics had these not been canceled due to the outbreak of World War II. After the war, Nicholas and his brother Robert founded the Winton Cup, which still remains the top fencing competition in Great Britain. In fact, if you can see the PowerPoint, it does say Winton Cup on it. Nicholas remained a Christian until the start of World War II. When the war took place, he saw ministers in both Britain and Germany blessing their troops before battle, and he couldn't believe that God could be on both sides of a war. So after that, he became a committed agnostic with no real religious affiliations. Instead of attending university after graduating from Stowe School in 1926, at the age of 17, Nicholas decided to enter into a career of banking. He worked in a number of banks, relatively low-level positions in the beginning, first in London, and then moved to Germany. Again, as you may remember, his initial first language was German, and he certainly benefited from being fluent. Since he was also fluent in France, he also worked in a number of banks in Paris. When he finally returned to England in 1937, he decided to shift careers from banking and became a broker at the London Stock Exchange. He became increasingly concerned about the rise of the Nazis in Germany. The background on that, in 1933, the Nazi Party gained a plurality, about 30% of the German Reichstag, in the German Reichstag, and Adolf Hitler was able to take his 30% plus of support in the Reichstag to get himself appointed as chancellor in Germany. This was soon followed by ever worsening anti-Jewish laws and anti-Semitic acts in Germany. Winton, who was going back and forth to Germany, in fact, spent some time in Germany in the 30s, saw firsthand the persecution of Jews by the Nazis. He also witnessed firsthand the arrival in England of distraught German Jewish immigrants, including close relatives and family acquaintances, who were able to get out of Germany in the early 1930s and the mid-1930s and move to Britain. He heard their stories of brutality and intimidation at the hands of the Nazis. In 1936, the family changed their name from Wertheim to Winton because they were concerned that having a Jewish-sounding last name, even in Britain, was not helpful during that period. Before discussing what Winton was able to accomplish, it's useful to try and provide a little bit of the overall geopolitical background of events in Europe, especially as these impacted on Czechoslovakia. Before Czechoslovakia, on March 13, 1938, Germany annexed, put that word in quotes, Austria in what was called the Anschluss. Essentially, Austria became part of Nazi Germany. Nearly 1 million cheering Austrians lined the streets of Vienna to welcome Adolf Hitler when he came to Vienna to symbolize the Anschluss, the combination of Germany and Austria. Hitler next turned his sights on Czechoslovakia. The country of Czechoslovakia was first established after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was split up after World War I, and a number of new countries were created, including, of course, Czechoslovakia. The western regions of the new country, called the Sudetenland, shared a border with Germany and had a large population of ethnic Germans. The Nazis encouraged these ethnic Germans to demand that the Sudetenland be annexed to Germany. An international conference was called in September of 1938 in Munich, largely to determine the fate of Czechoslovakia. The conference in Munich was attended by the heads of state of Great Britain. We should switch the PowerPoint. Was attended by the heads of state of Great Britain, of course, Neville Chamberlain, of France, Edouard Daladier, Italy, Benito Mussolini, and of course, Germany, Adolf Hitler. Among the concessions that were made, Britain and France agreed that Germany could annex the Sudetenland, the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain felt that this, in his words, quote, minor concession to Hitler, would again, in his words, quote, buy peace in our time. As a result, 1 month later, after the Munich conference had concluded, the Nazis moved into the Sudetenland in late 1938. Hitler personally came to the Sudetenland to claim the territory for Germany. Thousands of Jews living in the Sudetenland began to flee to Prague, hoping that they would be safe here. This is a remarkable picture of a Czech woman who's unable to conceal her great misery as she dutifully salutes Hitler when he arrived into that part of Czechoslovakia. Unrelated, but similarly, 1 month later, after the Nazis had moved into the Sudetenland in October, on November 9 to 10 in 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, took place in both Germany and Austria. Kristallnacht, which is again in November and is another date that is commemorated around the world ever since. About 30,000 Jews were arrested in Germany, many of them placed into concentration camps or prisons, ostensibly for their own protection. Nearly 200 synagogues were destroyed. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. Jewish businesses were smashed. In response, to their credit, the British government came up with new immigration laws, and they amended their immigration laws to enable Jewish children from Germany and Austria to immigrate into Britain if they met certain criteria, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. And this set the stage for what later came to be called Operation Kindertransport. No other country, sadly, took similar measures. It's important to keep these events in mind when we review what Nicholas Winton was able to accomplish, essentially during the period from January 1 to September 1, 1939. In 1938, Nicholas Winton was a 29-year-old stockbroker living in London. He enjoyed the single life of being a stockbroker. He had a small apartment and was living quite happily. He had a close friend, a teacher named Martin Blake, with whom he periodically went on vacation. The previous winter, in 1937, they had gone to Switzerland to go skiing and had decided they had such a good time they would like to do it again. They made all of their reservations, booked places to stay. Then, on December 22nd, 1938, Winton got a cable from his friend Martin Blake saying that instead of Switzerland, he decided to go to Prague, and Blake asked Winton if he would go to Prague as well. Winton was aware that there were refugees, including Jews, intellectuals, Roma, social democrats, and other minorities who were being targeted by the Nazis, who were fleeing from the Sudetenland into Prague. Camps were set up, largely tents, to accommodate the over 250,000 people who were now refugees in and around Prague, many of them Jewish having fled from the Sudetenland. Winton arrived in Prague on New Year's Eve to join his friend Martin Blake. The Nazis had already taken control of the Sudetenland, but had not yet moved into the rest of Czechoslovakia. Obviously, they had not yet moved into Prague. Winton quickly concluded that it was inevitable for the Germans to want to take control of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And so he sent a message to the British embassy in Czechoslovakia saying that the Germans would soon move to occupy the rest of the country. He got a response saying that he was, quote, too much near the woods to see the trees. He wrote later, unfortunately, I proved to be right. Winton had no experience, no connections in dealing with the problems that he saw. Still, he decided to do what he could do to save people. So the next day, after he had arrived in Prague, he went to the office of a brand new organization called the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, BCRC, which was headed by an economist also starting out with no background in this beforehand, by the name of Doreen Warner, who had only arrived in Prague a few weeks earlier. The organization had been set up in an attempt to organize safe transit to Britain for those who were at most risk from the Nazis. Warner's tiny little office was overwhelmed with people. Winton later told an interviewer, quote, all I knew was that people couldn't get out. I knew something had to be done to save as many children as possible. He then wrote a letter to his mother, Barbara Winton, who was still in London, in which he rattled off a series of questions to her to find answers that he needed before he could finally get started. He wanted to know if the British government would allow children into Britain. If so, under what circumstances? He set up an office at the dining room table of the hotel where he was renting a room near Wenceslas Square. He was not concerned by the fact that he had no experience, no background in doing this type of work, no organization to assist him, and no official assignment, and no funding. Once it became known, however, that there was someone concentrating on rescuing children, Winton was soon besieged from early morning until late at night by parents coming to beg for his help to get their children out of Britain. Winton later recalled, quote, those parents were desperate. It was heartbreaking to listen to their stories. They knew all too well what their fate was likely to be. Their first thought was for their little ones, never for themselves. Practically all of those parents ultimately perished in the camps. Winton knew he could only help children who had a sponsor or a potential foster parent in England. He determined that the way to do this was to prepare two lists. And this is an example of one of the lists. First, he needed the names of those who wished to escape to Britain. And second, he needed a list of people in England who were willing to take in a child. He focused on the first list immediately to put together those whose names and photos and background information he could then take with him or produce in England for the second list, which was those who were willing to take the children. So while he was still in Prague, Winton started to compile the first list, photos and details of children, all of which ultimately wound up in the scrapbook that was referenced earlier. When he realized the enormity of his task, and he had only had a 2-week vacation, Winton cabled his boss at the stock exchange and asked for a 3rd week of vacation. He received a rather dismissive letter from his boss dated January 9th, to the effect that he should stop worrying about, quote, the poor devils who are suffering through no fault of their own. Besides, his boss asserted, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain would be able to deal with these problems. Although his boss had told him, to arrive at his desk on Monday, Winton did not listen to that and decided to stay 1 week longer and ultimately returned to England on January 21. So essentially, he was only in Prague for 3 weeks. Before he left Prague, he was able to secure funds to fly 20 children to London on January 12. He went to the airport to see the plane take off with the 20 children. The most famous photos of Winton with the children were taken, with any of the children, were taken prior to this flight. Sadly, the boy with whom he is photographed, a little boy named Hansi Beck, died shortly after of an ear infection. The first transport was the only one in which children were flown to England. All subsequent transports to England were done on trains. The first transport was also the only one funded by the Barbican Mission, which was an organization whose purpose was to convert Jews to Christianity. Winton didn't care. He wanted to ensure as many children would be saved as possible. On January 17, so 5 days later, he arranged for a second flight, this time for 30 children, to fly to safety in Stockholm, Sweden. When Winton eventually flew back to London on the 21st of January, he brought with him hundreds of pictures and details about children whose parents hoped to save them from the Nazis. While Winton worked at his stock exchange job by the day, in the evenings and weekends, he devoted his time to his, in his words, quote, unofficial job, namely bringing children out of Czechoslovakia to find homes for them in Britain. Winton first wanted to work with the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, the BCRC, whom he had met when he was in Prague, but he found the committee too slow and bureaucratic. Still, he came up with a rather ingenious plan to use their name to his own advantage. He took some of their stationery when he went to the office and then had it reprinted, adding the words Czechoslovakia Children's Section under the title. Then he appointed himself the honorary secretary of the Children's Section of the BCRC. As you can see at the top of the stationery, it says British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, Children's Section. He appointed himself the honorary secretary of the Children's Section, which did not exist. He used his own home address for the new agency that he had just invented. He later told an interviewer, quote, I was the honorary secretary of this unofficial body that did not exist. I had no office. I had no staff. The committee was me, working from my house, as well as my mother and some volunteers. He later said that if he had waited for official approval from the BCRC, none of this would have happened. As mentioned before, the House of Commons had previously approved a measure to allow entry into Britain for refugees younger than 17, provided that they had a place to stay, a medical certificate, a warranty of £50, which is approximately $3,000 or a bit more today, plus a foster parent or a guarantor to look after the child after until they reached the age of 17. Completion of a rather complicated application would lead to an entry permit being issued. Next, he had to find British foster parents or others who were willing to take in the children and pay the £50 for each child. In order to do so, he placed ads in newspapers, sent brochures around to find potential foster parents. Then he had to match the desires of prospective parents or foster homes with a child who might meet their stipulations. If they mentioned a preference based on age or sex, Winton would send them a card with pictures that matched their request. If the prospective foster parents did not specify a preference, Winton sent them a card with a few pictures so that they could make a selection. Winton later expressed a great deal of remorse about those children on the cards who were not picked. He described this, quote, as a bit of a lottery who came. Those who were not selected, Winton said, sadly probably ended up being murdered by the Nazis. Once a child was selected, they would get a British entry card with all of their information on it. The cards enabled each child to enter England, which of course saved their lives. The first lists of available children were compiled by Winton when he was still in Prague. After he had returned to London, these lists and the other materials were collected by Doreen Warner and her associate, both of whom remained in Prague for a bit longer. After he returned to London, he began to work with the children as best as to get more children out as best as he could. Here's a photo of a man holding the papers secured for him by Nicholas Winton that allowed him to escape when he was still a child. The first transport train left Prague for England on March 14, 1939. Only hours later, on March 15, the first train left on the 14th. On the 15th, the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. Hitler personally arrived in Prague to celebrate the takeover on March 15, 1939. On the next day, March 16, the Nazis paraded around the Prague castle to celebrate their taking over of Czechoslovakia and Prague. The Nazis then staged a huge parade in Wenceslas Square in Prague to celebrate and to underscore that they were in control of the country. Remarkably, even after the Nazis took control of Prague, over the course of the next 6 months, Winton and his associates were able to arrange for 7 more transports, trains leaving from Prague, with the children ultimately arriving in England. Each of the trains used the same route. What's remarkable is Nazi soldiers arrived at the train station when the children were being taken away. The scene at the train station was enormously dramatic, both joyous and traumatic. The children were brought to the train station by their parents and other relatives and friends. They were given identification numbers to wear around their necks. This was followed by an emotional moment when the children said goodbye to their parents. There were scenes of indescribable anguish and tears when mothers and fathers kissed their children for the last time and hugged them and put them on the trains. In virtually every case, with very few exceptions, they would never see their children again, and the children would never see their parents again, although none could know that at the time. One of the children who was saved at the time was a young boy, now an older man, by the name of Hugo Meisel. He recounted the moment when he was put on the train by his parents. Quote, "I remember that my parents told me we were going to England for 2 or 3 months, that it would be a holiday, and that they would join us very shortly thereafter." But his parents never came for them. Their names are now painted on the walls of Prague's Pincus Synagogue, where the names of every Czech Jew who was murdered in the Holocaust is remembered. It is an astounding wall in Prague, if any of you can ever get there to see it. While the children may not have understood what was going on, their parents obviously did. For example, a mother wrote to Winton from Prague in English, dated August 15, 1939, to thank him, quote, "with all my heart for your help. We will never forget what you did for us and what you do for other children." After the children boarded the train, they would look out of the window to see their parents, often for the last time. When the train arrived at the Hook of London, they boarded a ferry for England. Then the children were put on a train and taken to London, where they would arrive at London's Liverpool Street Station, where they were met by Winton and his mother and their prospective foster parents. The scrapbook contained a note by Winton about the arrival of one such transport. Quote, "I have never seen a more moving sight than the arrival of 130 Czech children at Liverpool Street's platform. They've been coming over in batches. One of the children was less than 3 years old. The eldest must have been around 15. Winton and his mother met every arrival and assisted in the formal handing over of the children to their foster families. Usually it went smoothly, but not always. Some potential foster parents did not arrive on time, and on occasion, they did not appear at all. But overall it worked, and the children went off with their new lives. Winton did everything he could to find people willing to take or sponsor children, as mentioned, including publishing notices in various newspapers and journals throughout Britain. Although it generally worked out well, not everyone was happy with Winton's business-like method of obtaining homes for the mostly Jewish children. One day, some rabbis arrived at Winton's home on Willow Road to complain to him about Jewish children going to Christian homes. He forcefully told them that he would not stop placing children wherever he could. Winton told the rabbis if they preferred a dead Jewish child to a potentially converted one, that was their problem and not his. By June 1939, Winton estimated that he had over 5,000 children listed on his various lists, compiled originally by him and then the BCRC staff that was still in Prague. Winton was deeply troubled that while he had thousands of names on the list, he could only save hundreds. The scrapbook contained a good deal of information on each child Winton was able to save. In addition to their names, and in most cases their photographs, he kept records of where they went in England. Winton realized the enormity of the task and the urgency of what he was doing. He was disappointed that England was only able to take in relatively small numbers of children who were able to flee from the Nazis. And so he sought to get help from other countries around the world. As a result, Winton sent letters to the leaders of other nations that were in opposition to the Nazis. One of those was the United States. Winton wrote a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, imploring Roosevelt to see if the United States could be helpful and open the door to the fleeing children. Remarkably, this letter from Winton to Roosevelt is now in the National Archives. The letter from the young stockbroker to the American president is totally remarkable. Now, if a private citizen had sent a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, the United States probably would have ignored it. But to receive a letter from the chairman of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia's Children's Section, the chairman of the Children's Section in person, required a response. And as a result, the United States State Department reviewed it and sent a cable to the American Embassy, which in turn contacted Winton and sent him a response stating, quote, and this is the next letter that Winton received from the State Department, instructions, quote, the United States is unable in the absence of specific legislation to permit immigration in excess of that provided for by existing immigration laws. As an aside, Senator Robert Wagner and and a congresswoman from Massachusetts sought to get legislation to admit children from the Nazis, and this was not even taken up by the Congress. Winton reflected upon the episode. Americans would not take any children, which was a pity. We could have gotten so many more out. He added that he didn't loiter on the response from the US. He explained we did not have time for negative attitudes. Sadly, Winton would experience an even bigger disappointment than the negative response he received from the United States. As mentioned, Winton and his associates were able to arrange for 8 transports from Prague. The 8th left on August 2nd, 1939, with 68 children on board. The 9th transport was scheduled to depart from Prague for London on September 1, 1939, with 250 children. It would have been by far the largest single transport of any that Winton and his colleagues were able to arrange. Unfortunately, on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. All borders were closed, and so the train was canceled literally hours before it was due to depart. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. In April 2014, when he was 105 years old, Winton reflected back when he was interviewed by the American TV program 60 Minutes on this last transport. Quote, the vision of those children waiting eagerly in Prague for the last aborted train still haunts me. If the train had been a day earlier, it would have come through. As far as I've been able, and I've done quite a lot of research on this, none of those children was ever heard from again. Once the Second World War started, there was nothing that Winton or anyone else could do for the remaining children, so his efforts ceased. He even left the aftercare of the operation to others, particularly his mother. His mother, Barbara, dealt with any problems arising for the children if their foster parents could no longer keep them, or if other issues arose, difficulties between the children and their foster parents. It's remarkable how most of the children who were saved went on to have successful and fulfilling lives despite the adversity that they had suffered. When the war started, Winton volunteered as an ambulance driver in France. Then he next served in the Royal Air Force. Because his eyesight was not good enough to be a pilot, he became a trainer for the RAF. After the war, Winton became the assistant director of the International Refugee Organization, which was part of the United Nations, designed by the new United Nations to assist refugees and displaced people from the World War II. He then became one of the one of the main supervisors in charge of the disposal of items looted from the Nazis and recovered by the Allies. And here's a picture of Winton working with the International Refugee Organization. Winton later said he was pleased that a large percentage of the funds that resulted from the sale of items that couldn't be restored to people because they couldn't find the original owners. These items were then sold. The money, a large part of it, went to the Jewish Agency, which later became the State of Israel. Winton's next job was at the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBR&D, located in Paris. On his first day on the new job, he met a 28-year-old Danish woman named Greta Gilstrup, whom he met, and ultimately they began dating, and ultimately they were married in 1948 in Denmark. They settled in Maidenhead, England, which is about 25 miles from London, where he became financial director for an ice cream factory named Glacier Foods. Basically, the Wintons had relatively normal lives, confronting problems faced by middle-class families in England, how to raise their children, deal with repairs for the house, and respond once their children acted out of order. He had a number of different jobs in different fields. He never made a great deal of money. They lived not very extravagantly. He retired at age 71, in 1971 at the age of 62. And this enabled him to deal with charity work, which he enjoyed more than anything else, particularly dealing with handicapped children and helping with the elderly. In 1983, Queen Elizabeth named him a member of the Royal Order of the British Empire, OBE, for his work with the elderly. He thought this would be the highlight of his life. No one could have known that 2 years later he would meet the Queen again to be knighted for his work in saving nearly 700 children. According to his daughter, he had only one brush with the law, and this took place much later in his life. His daughter Barbara, named for his mother, she mentioned that he was caught speeding, driving 38 miles per hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. He was 98 at the time. Although Greta and Nicholas had a warm, loving relationship, he forgot to tell her about his activities in saving the children in 1939. She might never have found out if she had not looked at the scrapbook when she was cleaning the attic. This in turn led to the programs on That's Life, when he met with those he had saved, and the audience was able to stand up, as shown before. Those who saved still call themselves Nicky's children, and it's estimated that there are now 6,000 people alive who would not be alive if it were not for Nicholas Winton. Soon after the That's Life program, a Slovak filmmaker by the name of Maciek Minek made a documentary entitled Nicholas Winton, The Power of Good. It was narrated in both the English and the Czech versions by an award-winning journalist for the Canadian Broadcasting Company named Joe Schlesinger, who, by the way, was saved as a child in 1939 by Nicholas Winton. The film won the 2003 International Emmy Award for Outstanding Documentary. Minek later directed another film using a combination of actors and interviewers called Nicky's Family, which came out in 2001 and won a number of international awards. In addition to the films made by Minek, Winton's story has been detailed in many articles and television programs, including a 60 Minutes feature. Once his story became public, he received numerous awards, as well as being hosted by international leaders. He was especially recognized by the Czech and the British government, honored by Václav Havel, the first democratically elected president of Czechoslovakia. The Czech government nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. On September 1, 2009, a special Winton train set forth from Prague, from the station where it should have left 70 years earlier. Winton, then aged 100, went to the train station to join with a number of those he had saved, Winton children. At the train station, a statue was unveiled of Winton standing there with children, and that statue was still present in Czechoslovakia. In fact, when I was last in Prague, it was sadly a week after Winton had died, and there were the thousands of flowers placed there by citizens of Prague in his honor. Winton in 2004 received the Czech Republic's highest honor, the Order of the White Lion. Winton was named a British hero, there's the statue, a hero of the British hero of the Holocaust and dubbed the British Schindler. He was knighted in 2002 in recognition of his work. In 2003, he received the Pride of Britain Award for lifetime accomplishment. In addition to being knighted by the Queen, he met the Queen again in 2008, together with his daughter at the time. There's now a memorial statue at Liverpool Street Station in London, where the Kindertransports arrived. In September 2010, another statue of Winton was unveiled, this time in his hometown of Maidenhead Railway Station. There's a wonderful photo of Winton sitting next to the statue of himself on a park bench. When he reflected back on his life at 105, Winton said modestly, quote, "I simply saw a need and I filled it. I wasn't anyone special. I saw what was going on and did what I could to help." He added that he thought, quote, "I made a difference to some people's lives." He went on to say, "I don't think I did anything special. The world, however, if I've learned anything, the world is more dangerous than it has ever been." He stated that there's nothing that can't be done if it's fundamentally reasonable. He frequently cited his motto, "If something is not impossible, there must be a way of doing it." There's a great way to end this program, and that is a 2-minute video that covers most of the items that we have discussed so far. So I'd like to end by thanking the Federation of South Palm Beach County for making today's presentation possible, and even more for all of the good work that they have done before the pandemic hit, and especially for all of the good work that they are doing now. And again, a good way to end this presentation is to look at a brief video that summarizes the talk we have just gone over.
All the letters. But back here is the list of all the children. This is Vera Diamant, now Vera Gissing. We did find her name on his list. Vera Gissing is with us here tonight. Hello, Vera. And I should tell you that you are actually sitting next to Nicholas Winton.
And it was just so wonderful, so terribly, terribly touching.
Can I ask, is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
Wow, that was really powerful. And there's actually someone on our Zoom call today, David Kirshner, who I want to introduce and who just has a few very brief comments to share. And he could have been on that TV show years ago. David, are you unmuted? We're trying to unmute you, let's see. Did he get unmuted?
Yeah, she's.
Okay, David?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Nurnberger, today is my 51st birthday, and I just simply wanted to thank you for giving me a wonderful birthday present. I was able to share your amazing presentation with my oldest child, and it was particularly meaningful to her as her grandfather was a kinder. And then her grandfather, my father's Yorkshire, is Thursday. So I couldn't ask for a better way to honor both his memory and all those impacted by the Kindertransport. Thank you so much for taking time to share your presentation.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you, David. Happy birthday. I have tears. Thank you, Ralph, for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing a piece of history that is hope and a relatively good ending, which is what we all can use these days, hope with a happy ending. And personally, it reinforces the work that our Federation does every day to rescue and help those in need. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Please look for an email from us with other ways to connect, which is so important with our Federation and our Jewish community. I was so thrilled to see actually some of our Sinai residents on there. And if I could throw you all a virtual kiss, I would. Tomorrow is Getting Your Docs in a Row, and Thursday we have Learning is Everything with Rabbi Dr. Leanne Weisberg. And please stay safe, be well. If you need anything or know anyone who needs anything, please call us 561-852-3100, and thank you, and stay healthy.